Good summer's morning to all of you, and welcome to our Antiracism and Decoloniality in the Humanities event. We are streaming live from the Washington, D.C. area, and we are so delighted to see such a great turnout this morning. We are especially delighted to see several students and non-AU members of the public. There is a poll being circulated. Some of you mentioned that it's not allowing you to submit if you don't answer all the questions, but we're still playing with this audience interaction modality. Please try to fill it out as best as you can, and we're taking the answers and sending them to the panelists so they get a sense of our. My name is Malini Ranganathan, and I am Associate Professor in the School of International Service. I serve as Interim Faculty Director of the Antiracist Research and Policy Center at American University.
And my name is Christine Platt, and I serve as the Managing Director of the Antiracist Research and Policy Center at American University. I join Malini in extending a warm welcome to all of you, and I am really looking forward to the conversation today.
We at the Antiracism Center believe that any agenda that aims to dismantle anti-Black and other forms of racism, that seeks to decolonize research and pedagogy, and that works towards intersectional liberation must be embedded in the arts, in history, and the humanities. This should be in addition to changing policy, law, and institutions. The renewed mission of the Antiracism Center here at AU is to leverage and amplify the work of our faculty, our students, and our staff. Our faculty are not only educators, but also come to this work from their activism, from their artistic practice, and from their identity. The conversation today is one in an exciting series we have planned for the summer and coming academic year. So please stay tuned for a conversation on empowering educators on August 19th, and one on nourishing Black futures, food justice, and Black maternal health on September 30th. So before I introduce our moderator today, I'd like to extend a note of thanks and then go on to a few housekeeping notes. First, a big note of thanks for all of you for being here, and also to the communications and events planning team at the College of Arts and Sciences at AU, and also to Professor Jessica Owens-Young for allowing us to use her beautiful art to advertise this event. So a few housekeeping notes. Please note that this event is being recorded. Live captioning will be available at the bottom of your screen throughout the event. Please access this by clicking on the CC closed captioning icon on the bottom of your toolbar. Please note that this is a Zoom webinar. This means that our audience's videos and audios are automatically turned off. However, you can interact with the panelists via the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and your questions will be answered either live or typed out by the panelists. Notice that you can click on the thumbs up icon to let our panelists know that there is broader interest in a certain question being asked. We are going to save time at the end for your questions, and we are really looking forward to them, so please don't hesitate to drop them into the Q&A box. For those of you who benefit from ASL interpretation, you will be able to see the interpreter in gallery view during the entirety of the event. I'd now like to introduce our moderator. Lily Wong is Associate Professor in the Departments of Literature and Critical Race, Gender, and Culture Studies at American University, a newly formed department that has been long in the making, thanks to Lily and many you will hear from today on the panel. Professor Wong is the author of Trans-Pacific Attachments, Sex Work, Media Networks, and Affective Histories of Chineseness. Her work focuses on the politics of identity and race, affect and emotion, gender and sexuality, and transnational solidarity movements against racism. Please join me in welcoming Lily Wong.
Thank you for the introduction, Malini. Thank you all. I am deeply honored that you invited me to moderate tonight's event, today's event. While the COVID pandemic has indeed heightened a lot of the linking systems of oppression and exploitation we see ourselves fighting today, such times also calls for the very coalitional and collaborative work of anti-racism and decolonization, work that our fellow panelists have all been deeply committed to here at AU and beyond. And so I'd like to start today's conversation by asking the fellow panelists to briefly introduce themselves. Sybil, can I start with you?
Sure.
Sybil, Sybil, how did you come to anti-racist work? And more broadly, how does this anti-racist framework inform your own scholarship and also creative practices?
Sure. I am Sybil Williams. I am a professor appointed both in the DPA and the newly formed CRGC. I'm so excited about that. I am program director for African American Diaspora Studies. We are a baby program, but growing rapidly, and I'm super excited about that as well. I come to anti-racism work by way of being a playwright and dramaturg. I'm an artist. Specifically and primarily, I am a playwright by trade. I come to this work by the lived experience I have as an African descended woman and the lived experience of my ancestors in working to combat anti-Blackness. I am most interested in Black women's healing rituals that include storytelling and using the spoken word to confront white supremacy by bludgeoning evil and by manifesting visions, hopes, and dreams through the power of our voice and speaking. I know that as a Black woman artist, life and death are born on the tongue. I know that as a Black woman artist, powerful art is that art which serves powerfully. I know that as a Black woman artist, to create art is to make the case for survival. So those are the aesthetics that I begin with, noting that art is political. When anybody from the margin speaks, it is automatically political. So I speak to make the case for my people to continue to flourish as they have using African aesthetics and African beauty practices. So that is where my work begins. I started doing that as a result of studying theater in South Africa and Tanzania, particularly theater for development. And I use those techniques to begin to build something called docudrama, which is to take the actual words of a subject, in one case, for example, Mumia Abu-Jamal, and to build a work called A Liberating Prayer, a love song for Mumia Abu-Jamal to confront the injustice of his case and to confront the death penalty in general. So that was the real beginning of my work 20 years ago, visiting Mumia on death row, living and embedding myself with the MOVE organization, and then building a multimedia installation performance piece to speak to his survival. I continue to do that using primarily things that have happened to Black women. So my latest two works that have been produced, I Am a Drum, was about an incident in 1999 where an African-American woman was dragged across the concrete and beaten pregnant by the police and detained for no reason other than a noise violation. So I use that incident to dramatize a work to explore Say Her Name further 2 years ago, and just recently created a work called Gloria and Rwanda, which talks about Black on Black violence. It's two women coming together, one who's lost a son, one whose partner was the shooter, and they come together to build, to create these beautiful skirts that Gloria is responsible for making, and to talk about healing. And in the end, the audience will also make a skirt with the name of their loved one on it, and we'll put the skirts up all over the theater. And that piece was done as a reading last year, and I'm still looking to find a place to do the larger work of building the artistic installation and the performance. So that has been the bulk of it. This year, fall 2021, I'm working with Nancy Snyder to create a work called One of 89, which is about the life of a woman who was part of the Lost Boys rescue group from the Sudan. There were 89 women, and she was one of them. And Nancy has interviewed her, and we are taking her work as well to build out a piece with music and art and language to talk about what that being a refugee means. So I'm deeply excited. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sybil. That's amazing. Sarah, would you like to go next?
I would. Thank you, Lily. So I'm Sarah Trembath. I am a writer, and I'm a lecturer in the Department of Literature's Writing Studies program. And I'm also an editor and a researcher. Here at AU, I teach writing, and I serve, as we all do, on several committees in which my anti-racist work is very central at this point. So the anti-racist framework, or more specifically the decolonial framework, intersects all over the place in my work. As a writer, my genre is called creative nonfiction. And what I do is academic researching. So my method is to get into archives and get into scholarly material and find out all I can about a subject. But then I render it back out, usually in language that I feel like is accessible for people interested in arts, for people outside of academia. So there's a lot of poetry and there's a lot of narrative in my work. And I'm also a poet. My personal journey to this kind of work, I would have to say, is probably racism. I don't think I'm unique in that way. I grew up in a predominantly white community in which people were very clearly divided between being non-racist, very racist, and I think mostly in between people who did not think of themselves as racist, but perhaps acted out of unconscious biases or stereotypes. And the ways in which, you know, I was loved and received as an equal, or myself and my people, you know, I have an expectation of being loved and respected as an equal, but in ways that racism hurt me, I would say probably still drives my thinking and my action to this day. It was never something that I could accept. And it led me to what I would have to describe as a state of wondering, like, why is it like this? You know, how young people do. And I was led through that wondering and through travel and through study to what I think are some of the more radical traditions. As I was reflecting on it for this panel, I was sort of thinking, why was I drawn to those radical traditions? And I think it's because at the time they were the most clear. You know, I'm 51, and when I was growing up, a lot of people weren't really talking about race. Other people were racist, but the people who were talking about it were, you know, radical people in the Black movement, and in my community, the Quakers, who I don't think have the reputation for being radical, but are. I studied with the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. I studied with Black Arts Movement, people in Philadelphia and the Black Panther Party in Baltimore. Their rhetoric, their rhetorical style is very clear, precise, and undiluted, and they were the people who were bringing the information at this time in which education was fully Eurocentric in almost every sphere. Some of my teachers actually started Black Studies in San Francisco in 1969. And so I'm a product of that generation's thinking, adapted to my current purposes here as a writer and a teacher and an editor.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sarah. Jordanna?
Great, thank you for having me here and for everybody coming. This is such a phenomenal group of individuals. So I am an assistant professor at the School of International Service, and I'm also an urban sociologist with fieldwork in Francophone West Africa, specifically in Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire. And my theoretical agenda examines Black masculinity in racial capitalism. Specifically within that, the intersection between political economy, so racial capitalism, and the politics of representation. So how Blackness, how Black masculinity has been seen and represented, and how that relates and is part of domination and resistance within racial capitalism. So my interest in the study of race and Blackness comes from a multiracial and international background. So as a mixed race person myself, I have personally seen different barriers and different opportunities for members of my own family that have had quite dramatic outcomes. And that comes from, you know, stories about my grandparents, stories about, you know, my mother's side of the family, their home being removed with urban renewal, and, you know, the outcomes of that, access to elite schools, different societal expectations with different kinds of consequences. So having seen up close how these different life chances unfold, it's made the kind of discussing race a very obvious thing to me, and something that actually shouldn't be surprising. It was never surprising to me, these kinds of different outcomes. And also, as with an international background, I'm a Black American who spent my early childhood in West Africa. So I actually didn't move to the United States until I was 8 years old. And then I moved to Minnesota, which definitely in the 80s was very, very, very white. And even then I still had a home. My father was still living in West Africa until I was a senior in high school. So it was my home, you know, for part of the year. So my experience of Blackness, including my own, has always been situated within a particular context and actually affiliations to power. And so understanding Blackness was actually very different when I went to West Africa, where because of my nationality, because of my skin color, I was not actually even considered Black. And years later, when I would do my field work, I would hear often people shout on the street, "La Blanche," the white woman. So having that experience and then going to the United States, where, you know, one of the first things people would ask me, the very kind of caring teachers, would be, "How are you doing?" You know, being a young child, having moved here, and I went to a private school. I was one of the only 2 Black children in my grade. And so there were these kinds of constant, very caring questions about something that actually surprised me as an identity, because I wasn't even aware of that, right? When I would identify people, it was always quite different. So my mixed race background, you know, and that affiliation to power, to nationality, to skin color, it from a very early moment brought an intersectional lens and an understanding of race rooted in relations of domination and power and histories, right? Colonial histories, imperial histories. And then as far as transforming that into an anti-racist agenda, that really came from when I started to study actually US histories of housing and urban, being an urban studies major as an undergrad, being aware of the federally mandated and the public and private forces that maintained and deepened inequality in this country, really politicized me, and it made me angry, but it also made me really focus on my studies. And when I went to grad school, I started to apply this to a global context, and that really deepened my understanding of the relationship between colonialism and contemporary inequality that situates African cities in this period of perpetual framing of crisis. So.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jordanna. Theresa, would you like to continue?
Sure. I'm Theresa Runstedtler. I'm an associate professor of history, but I'm also in the critical race, gender, and culture studies department, no longer a collaborative, so that's hugely exciting. My work actually resonates a lot with Jordanna's. I look at the history of the intersection of race, particularly Blackness, masculinity, labor, and popular culture, with an eye for the intersection of race and sport, in particular in professional sports. My first book was a global history of the first Black world heavyweight champion, Jack Johnson, who was champion in the early 1900s. And the book that I'm currently working on is a trade book, and it's called Black Ball, and I'm looking at Black basketball players in the professional leagues and how they transformed the game of hoops in the 1970s, both on and off the court. In terms of my personal journey to my areas of study and anti-racism and decoloniality, I actually grew up in Canada. So, and where I grew up, I was one of the very few non-white people in the area where I lived. And so having an immigrant mother I could see from a very young age how she was treated quite differently. And the interesting thing is that where I was growing up, we never talked about race. We had no language to talk about why these things were happening, and even how to see it as part of a sort of wider system of racism and anti-racism. So I took a course when I was in my third year of university on African American history, and it just literally blew my mind. I was like, wow, there's a whole movement about this. So I just, started reading voraciously about the civil rights movement, learning about how people in the United States understood racism historically, institutionally, structurally. And when I came to grad school back in 2001 in the US, I wanted to take that learning and that language in both history and critical race theory and bring it back to Canada, but I ended up staying here. So now you're stuck with me because I'm married to an American and have an American child. But also to my journey into looking at, I guess, race and popular culture comes out of the fact that when I graduated from university, like many people, I had no idea what I wanted to do, for my adult life. So I became a professional dancer and performer, and I had an agent who would get me gigs. And I saw how racism was embedded in the everyday practices of casting, what kinds of roles you would get called in for, to audition for. And of course, this was intersectional as well, being a woman and being a woman who was ambiguous racially, and had a certain kind of look that fit into archetypes, primarily in the American media, because we did a lot of American television shows, and I would get called in for the full array of brown woman parts, regardless of whether, I had any sort of connection in terms of my identity to those roles, and often would get called in for parts where I'd have to play the woman of ill repute, strippers, the girl, the girlfriend of the gangster, like all these types of things. And I just didn't see a future for myself, but it really kind of opened my mind to how these issues of representation are about popular culture, but they're also about the structure and the institution of media. Then I worked for a national sports network in Toronto, and every day, I was not involved in production, but I was in audience relations and public relations. And I would see every day the expectations that the mostly white male journalists would have of the mostly Black male athletes. Expectations about their exchanges. They should be grateful. They should answer questions in a particular way. Without reference to anything dealing with the outside world, so to speak. And so it was all very eye-opening for me. And really, I wanted to not just find a language with which to describe what I was seeing, but also figure out how historically we got to where we were, not just in the US, but also how the US is such a huge, it's such a huge disseminator of ideas, in particular about anti-Blackness and about race more generally, being political and cultural power in the world. So that's really my kind of unconventional journey into this.
Thank you, Theresa. Eileen?
Hi, everyone. I am a professor of Latin American and Caribbean history, and I'm also currently the chair of the Department of Critical Race and Gender and Cultural Studies, the CRGC. I encourage all of you who are AU students or faculty members to come find us. Just a quick plug, we have 5, soon to be 6 interdisciplinary programs, all of which offer majors and minors. So we welcome you all into the CRGC as well as the Anti-Racist Policy Center. So about my own journey, for almost a decade during the 1980s, I worked as a bilingual community organizer in a low-income post-industrial area of Philadelphia. It's interesting that so many of us have connections in our own histories to Philly. This section of the city encompasses African American, Puerto Rican, and white ethnic communities, and the organization with which I worked organized around broad issues that affected all three of these communities. And we did it in ways specifically meaningful to each community, but always striving to build connections across racial and cultural divides. So I learned a number of lessons during these years in Philadelphia, which I ultimately took with me into my life as a university-based scholar teacher. And I should say that I was launched into the academy by teaching adults in this through this organization and realizing that history really, really mattered a lot. So a number of lessons. First, that enduring social change is only forged by building trust and longstanding relationships, and this takes time. So impatience in our work is really counterproductive. Second, I learned that compelling historical research, like successful organizing, excavates all sorts of long forgotten or denied experiences and worldviews and holds them up to the light. So these can provide material for new thinking about long-standing divisions and exploitation that people experience. If we can find out that things haven't always been this way, if the world as we know it isn't the natural order of things, then it can be remade. And this simple insight can be really incredibly empowering, both in organizing outside the university and also in the university with our work here. These shifts in our understanding of the world can accumulate over time to create broad-based movements for social justice based on the everyday interactions of everyday people on the ground. And so in my years in Philadelphia, I saw this, and I learned to not focus solely on those who occupied institutional positions of power. I learned that there are potentials everywhere for forming new alliances. But I also learned, really intensively, that these sorts of connections, when they're formed, always have their limits. For example, I participated in organizing a really vibrant interracial movement that involved Puerto Rican, white, and African-American women to resist domestic violence. But in this part of Philadelphia, and across the city of Philadelphia, certainly, this did not translate. Women's connection to each other and the creations of shelters, which were bilingual and which welcomed women into safe spaces, did not at all translate into common understandings of other sorts of violences, like police brutality, right? So that these movements that get formed are always going to have their limits. And when I became a historian of the Spanish-speaking Caribbean and its diaspora, my own research focus is on Puerto Rico, which is rooted in that past of mine in Philadelphia. And I then began to dedicate myself to understanding how race, gender, class, and colonialism, which I didn't know as much about in Philly, intertwined to form the everyday fabric of people's lives, these institutions that seek to control working people, and all of the visionary possibilities and also the deep, deep limits of Puerto Rican struggles for justice. I think I'll leave it there, and if people want to talk about other things later, we can.
Great, thank you, Eileen. Marcelo?
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me here, and thank you to the Center for organizing this event. Thanks, Lily, for moderating, and thanks to all the participants for being here. My name is Marcelo Bohrt. I'm an assistant professor at the School of International Service. I'm a sociologist who specializes in the sociology of race, political sociology, and cultural sociology. And in my work, broadly, what my research agenda seeks to do is to understand the centrality and workings of race and racism across various dimensions of modern life. Large part of my work is focused on Latin America, but I've also examined how race and racism operate across different national contexts. At this point, I'm engaged broadly in two complementary, strands of research. In one, I study ethnographically and historically the relationship between race and state building in Bolivia specifically, but in Latin America, with an interest in Latin America more broadly. And in a second strand of research, I look at the ways in which race and class intersect to shape the life trajectories of ethno-racial minorities and immigrants in the United States. Having said that, I want to say that I love this conversation that we're having right now, and the question, right? Not only who we are and what we do, but how did we come to do this? And one of the reasons why I love it in the context of this particular panel is because this has been an invitation that critical postcolonial feminist scholars have been making for many decades, right? That we should be really transparent and direct about not only our epistemological and methodological commitments, right? How do we do research, what we think knowledge is and all that, but also about how our biographies have shaped our academic projects, right? And this question about how we came to anti-racism is precisely about that. And in part, these scholars made this critique as a critique to, you know, important academics of their time who claimed to be, you know, objective and unbiased, and were very unwilling to examine how their biographies and social locations, in fact, shaped and deeply biased the ways in which they thought about questions like race or inequality or whatever the topic at hand was. In any case, how did I come to do this work? You know, I grew up in a middle-class urban family in Bolivia as a white mestizo kid, but in the moment of an epochal moment of social mobilization and change in Bolivia, around the country, indigenous origins Bolivians, but also economically marginalized people were mobilizing in the 90s and early 2000s for, you know, for rights recognition, and later into the 2000s for a deeper reckoning of the colonial and neo-colonial foundations of the Bolivian state and Bolivian society. So as I was growing up early, you know, all of this was happening. It was constantly on the news, this march, this protest, this law, this reform, this constitutional reform. And I think I was trying to make sense of what this was, right? Specifically in a context like Bolivia and Latin America, where there has been historically a kind of deep denial of race, or a kind of, you know, color blindness to the ways that we think about our political context. You know, at some point in my teens, I got my hands on some of the books by the Uruguayan thinker Eduardo Galeano, who wrote a couple of books, you know, The Open Veins of Latin America, several books, but, you know, these two that I read, I remember early on, were The Open Veins of Latin America, it's like, you know, and The World Upside Down, which were kind of like a leftist critical accounts of politics in Latin America, but that illuminated the workings of capitalism and its intersection with race. And it was really, you know, I think a key moment of kind of raising or offering some understanding at the time for me. But then soon after, my family and I left Bolivia and immigrated into the US and settled in the US. And I think that, you know, two things happened. One is I came to live this immigrant experience and occupy this position as a Latino man in Texas. And on the other hand, of course, this moment, these changes, these political changes were happening in Bolivia, and I was far, and I couldn't be part of them in any kind of direct way. And I think I found in research and once I enrolled in university and started taking courses, I found a way to think about how to contribute, which was through writing and through research, and one of the key points that became, I guess, one of the driving goals of my research agenda and links to anti-racism was challenging that kind of historical color blindness, right? In many of my interactions, I would notice a kind of deep persistence to listen to the demands of, you know, indigenous origin Bolivians. And so I wanted to write so that I could speak to those, in particular, those Bolivians who were resistant to that, and show through this ethnographic or historical research how, in fact, race was central constantly to all the politics that, you know, to the politics that permeated our country, to our lives, to our personal histories, and all that. And that's, I think, how I came to academia, and how I came to do research, and in particular to focus on Bolivia, which is a way to do anti-racist work at a distance and stay connected to Bolivia.
Thank you so much, Marcelo. I love that you brought up this very epistemology of post-colonial feminists and women of color feminists that have been really embedded in anti-racist work, right? The theories in the flesh, right? And so my next set of questions will dive directly into that. How do we connect then the personal with the political and the scholarly in that sense? So Sybil, I'd like to start with you again. So I was thinking about how then your individual work speaks to larger stakes in your respective disciplines. So for instance, Sybil, how does the very powerful African and African-American aesthetics that you allude to in your opening statements, how does that inform Black artists' engagement with anti-racism in performance? And how do you see that historically, and how do you see that continuing in the future as yourself a practitioner?
Fundamentally, the beauty of African American arts is that it's always resisted anti-Blackness. And it's done it in a very simple way by relying on an African aesthetic, right? So instead of allowing itself to be defined and determined by a white performance aesthetic or whiteness, it has always relied solely on itself. And we see this moving forward from spirituals, work songs, all the way up through the blues, all the way up through hip hop. And in that regard, it has, those African aesthetics have found their way into all kinds of American music. Hence, it's created jazz, it's created rhythm and blues, which then created rock, et cetera, et cetera. But more specifically, looking at, if we're very careful and we look at performance techniques, African performance techniques, for example, the predominance of a percussive aesthetic. We look at that use of a drum beat. We often identify African aesthetics by the drum beat, by the rhythm of the dance, African dance making rhythm visible, right? But it's doing something else. That drum is calling from the womb of the earth in the African tradition, spirits into being, which invite all the participants in a particular performance space to come into a sacred space. So that drum beat, even as it's secularized, is opening up sacred space for performers and participants alike. So when a DJ comes on in a club and says, how can I move the crowd? He isn't just talking about throw your hands up and clap to the beat. He's saying, come into my sacred space and let me introduce you to time immemorial. You're going to run into Harriet Tubman and all kinds of people here, as well as me, and you're going to share great time and great space with them. And that way the art is communal. It's not just communal because we're all together. It's communal because we're sharing ancient time and space, and that's an African tradition. And at the heart of that, as Robert Farris Thompson says, is what it means to be cool. It understands, I'm calling you as an artist into this sacred space with this particular music or sound or word rhythm, but I'm also part of a group. I'm no better than you, and I am no different than you. So we are making art together. No one is subordinated. And in that regard, art is also efficacious. If it doesn't serve the community, it's not made. Like, we don't make art that doesn't serve the community. And I'm taking that form, again, looking at the reasons why hip hop was originally made. And that is because it needed to speak to the 80s in the Bronx with what was happening to destroy urban America. So urban African Americans found a way to fight back. And so in my own work, I'm always looking at those ways in which community is finding ways to revive itself. And I'm also looking at art for life's sake. How do we tell stories so that people can survive? I'm also looking at word magic. How do we speak our dreams into existence, which in the African technique or tradition by Robert Farris Thompson, again, is called the nomo. You speak into existence what you want to have. And finally, I'm looking at efficacious technique. It doesn't have to be beautiful. It has to work. It has to work. And therefore, art is always something that's in process. The beauty is the struggle that it's having to work. And so when I think about performance, I never think of finished work. I think about what I'm going to give the audience to do when they leave.
Wonderful, Sybil. That was so powerful. I love that. And so hinging on to that question about the work and doing the work, I would like to turn to you, Sarah. Can you tell us a little bit about your work as yourself who has artistic practices and also your research agendas that are kind of meshed together? how does that inform your particular work with first-year students? And how, in turn, do the students influence your work in art as well?
Yeah, well, I think that the process that I described of how I got into this work really predisposes me to thinking in terms of systems and histories, because I was exposed to, the wonderings that I had about inequalities really were answered in terms of these big, a lot, very much related to what Sybil just said, the depths of history and the expanse of the globe. And so I really think globally, even when I'm approaching particular things with my students, everything for me is situated in the colonial experiment. And it exposes me to histories and narratives from the margins. So a lot of times what I'm doing in my classroom, and I have to say this, like, I'm very opposed to indoctrinating my students. Like, I am not that professor that stands there and tells people what to think so they can think like me. But I do expose them to counter narratives because most of them were Eurocentrically educated, either to a small degree or a great degree. And so a lot of what I know through my research is news to them. And so I can provide counter narratives and help them put texts in conversation with each other. My big research project these days has to do with looking at K through 12 textbooks in history. I am not a historian, but like I said, my worldview continually draws me back to history, and I'm a deep believer in what's called the Sankofa ethic, which has to do with bringing things back from the past in order to create a better future. So my big project right now, which has been going on for 4 or 5 years, has to do with studying K through 12 textbooks, the commercially produced textbooks, and the biases within them. So the thing that I created out of this study is a maybe 24 source synthesis and meta-analysis, right? Where I read all those things and organized them according to themes. And I looked at what people who study textbooks are finding. And I also have like a stack of actual textbooks that I read to sort of understand where the biases, the racial biases are embedded. And from that document, which I haven't published and I don't intend to, I draw all of my other projects. So I'm creating a website, I'm doing a book proposal, I have 2 classes that I'm teaching here that have to do with textbook bias. The Information Literacy Committee, which I co-chair, got a mini grant and we're doing a subject guide, and textbook bias is a section on that. I have a couple of articles that I published out of it. And so that's how my research is manifesting these days, very academically researched, but really sort of publicly distributed or distributed through my students. My students are the motivation for all this. So what I think started out as a very personal journey is now like, what do they know? Like, how prepared are they for critical thinking around culture and race and things? And so as I stand in my classrooms and I offer these things, like, it's very important for me to help them develop critical thinking around these topics that might be new to them. AU research shows that the vast majority of our students, like vast majority, come from communities that they describe as racially and ethnically and culturally monolithic. So as a first-year teacher, my students are encountering each other across culture for the first time. And my research in a lot of ways helps them, I think, navigate that, both intellectually and personally.
I love it. Thank you, Sarah. And this brings me to my question for you, Jordanna. Thinking about, thinking through the personal and the relational, I know a lot of your work centers on visuality. Could you say a little bit more about how that attention to visuality connects to your own ethnographic work in Africa as well?
Sure. So actually, even the ethnographic, as Marcelo had discussed, and some others, also ties into the historical, right? And it has to. But visuality, that is both for me a research method, but for everyone a mode of communication. And so much of what we communicate in society is visual. And in that sense, the academy, you know, journal articles, that kind of thing, it's way behind. You have to push to get visual in an academic publication, for example, in a journal article, and I've definitely had that fight before. But it's also a common sense way of conveying ideas, and I use that in a kind of a Gramscian common sense, right? Which is also dangerous, right? And because it constructs a notion of truth that can be very misleading. But for me, so in my fieldwork, so the visual, it's of particular relevance to my research agenda, because when I think about Blackness in racial capitalism, you have to begin with the history of the idea of Black in itself is a history of erasure, right? Of collapsing the diverse histories and humanity of Africans into a totalizing identity of Blackness that was then used to justify slavery, right? You have no history and you are just a color. And so from the French tradition, for example, even the slave trade was a derogatory term for Black, but the trade of Blacks. And that was kind of the typical way you discuss the slave trade. So oppression has been rooted in the literal fact of Blackness, right? But so has resistance, right? There's this constant dialectic. So we have Black as beautiful, we have Black power. And this is where I really come in and try to understand. I try to understand how this dialectic of negation and affirmation has also made Blackness susceptible to what I say a synthesis of commodification. And that actually speaks also, Theresa said that, you know, our work, we definitely have in intersecting interests. But I try to understand how commodified representation of Blackness in the diaspora. And this is actually of many ways of looking at Blackness, but a major strand is understanding how this kind of US hegemon understanding of Blackness ends up circulating throughout the Black Atlantic, so that men otherwise excluded from the global economy, in fact, end up celebrating US Blackness as liberatory, as a model to aspire to, while collapsing actually the struggles and the negations of Blackness back in the States. And just for an example of that, one of the men from my study who I'm still in touch with on Facebook, he regularly sends me a couple, you know, hellos, and we have a little back and forth. And at the height of the George Floyd protests, he was applying for, you know, the lottery and saying, I just want to get to the US. I just want to get to the US, you know, and there was just, and constantly when I would be there and I would say that Black men have it really hard, there was a response of, there's you, who's just one person, and then there's the truth, which is MTV, which is mass media. And for me, they would constantly dismiss what I would discuss as struggles, because the translation that was, you know, came from these circuits of mass media, it told another kind of truth. And so that's what I try to understand. And specifically how these visual representations in popular culture become really important.
I love that. Thank you, Jordanna. And now I'm thinking through the connection between the visual and the popular, which I'd like to turn to you, Theresa. As you've noted in your opening remarks, you do the history of professional sports, specifically boxing and basketball, in a national and transnational context. So my question to you is this: why sports? What does the study of sport reveal about not only the workings of racism and anti-Blackness, but also the ways in which we can undo it or resist it or challenge it?
Sure. Before I start talking about that, I know that there's been a question about how do we actually decolonize our material in the classroom, and I'm going to relate that to my approach to research as well. I'm very much like Sarah. I am very interested in debunking or providing alternatives to common narratives about history. So I'm really about trying to provide counter narratives, and in the plural, and trying to offer different modes of contextualizing events than the popular ones that are out there, rather than trying to be encyclopedic or comprehensive. So really, I set it up as a way to kind of model this habit of questioning. And questioning, in fact, those very same kind of hyper-visual narratives that we are constantly inundated with. So two reasons that sport plays into that larger project of producing counter-narratives. Number one, I focus primarily on Black professional athletes, Black male professional athletes, and they move across borders, not just physically, but also in terms of their images, news of them, etc. So when I looked at Jack Johnson in the early 1900s, one could say that he was the most famous Black man on the planet. And so one of the things that showed me as he traveled to these different spaces was that different colonial officials were trying to figure out what to do with this unruly Black man who didn't really care for the racial etiquette of the area. What do we do with him? How do we control him? How do we contain him? How do we make sure that he doesn't pollute the ideas or the thoughts of local people? And he was constantly searching for a space where racism maybe didn't exist. But everywhere he went, whether it was London, Paris, you know, Cape Town, Sydney, he kept bumping up against, you know, white supremacy. And so in constructing that narrative, I sort of pulled him out of his typical context, which is the domestic context and his fight against Jim Crow, and was able to tell a larger story about the intersection of all these different movements against these transnational flows and structures and systems of white supremacy. And then I guess I want to be optimistic here and seeing also how this submerged history can reveal solidarities potentially across borders that could be cultivated and that are there and often, you know, nascent. So that's one thing. The second thing is, you know, quite frankly, I would rather read sports magazines than administrative documents. So that kind of brought me into that. But the other thing that reading those types of primary sources does is it begins to immerse you in a kind of popular discussion of race that's not from experts, so to speak. You know, how did the average sports fan understand what Blackness was in the 1970s, for example? So I'm working on this book about pro ball in the 1970s. And one of the things that I keep on bumping up against is that the 70s were imagined as this kind of dark era of, no pun intended, professional basketball, where there was, you know, too much drugs in the league. They were bringing in crime. They were changing, you know, how basketball was played into this very sort of selfish, lazy game. And I kind of take a step back and say, okay, but this is the exact same moment that Black players became 75 to 80% of the league. So what are these narratives about how Black men are playing? You know, what are they telling us about these common sense ideas about Black people more generally and Black men in particular? And how does this become the sort of fertile ground from which, you know, policy gets constructed? So I'm always thinking about the relationship between these common sense ideas of race and then how they get translated into institutions, laws, and other structures.
Thank you, Theresa. That's great. The linking between the common sense into the institutional, and then the point that you talk about kind of pulling out from the domestic these larger structures that are transnational. And that leads me into my question for you, Eileen and Marcelo. Eileen, I know your work is transnational, right? It looks across gender, race, class in Puerto Rico and Cuba and the diasporas. Can you speak a little bit more about the work that you do and how specifically storytelling has informed your work as a historian on this transnational scope?
Sure, thanks. So I was originally trained when I went to graduate school by Marxist social historians of Latin America who emphasized both the power of working people, but also the deep structures that were transnational and created by colonialism. And so I come out of that tradition, but I wanted to talk about storytelling, especially because this is a panel on the humanities, because for me, beginning to place storytelling at the center of my own historical analysis was really crucial and transformed how I understood history and how I did that analysis. I found for the first time that I could acknowledge the power, this is what Sybil was talking about, but that I could acknowledge the power of the aesthetics of social sources, whether in the beauty or the crushing weight of their symbols and their rhythms and the narrative structures. And that was the case whether I encountered court documents in historical archives or whether I watched these aesthetics unfold in oral history interviews or in the collective recounting of family memories. And so with this work and focus on storytelling, I came to really recognize everyday people not only as organizers of movements, which is obviously really important, and strugglers against exploitation, but also as artists of the word. And that was a really powerful move for me. So, and then second, paying attention to the stories that people told in all of these different venues and historical contexts really began to open up to me new understandings of how racial identities have worked for Puerto Ricans throughout the 19th and 20th century. Puerto Ricans' physical phenotypes definitely affected their historical experiences of race, but these phenotypes didn't definitively determine Puerto Ricans' racial identities. I discovered that on the island, under Spanish colonialism, for example, Puerto Ricans' sexual practices and their adherence to or rejection of dominant norms of respectability and honorable behavior could either blacken them or whiten them. And I found that actually discussions of sexual morality or unruliness became a really important way that 19th century Puerto Ricans of all different social classes talked about race and created racial labels without actually directly naming racial distinctions. But these discussions about morality became a really, really powerful way of creating racial identities. And then in another project, when researching the experiences of Puerto Ricans migrating to and from the US in the 20th century, I confirmed other scholars' findings that the ways Puerto Ricans were racialized in the US could differ really dramatically from the racial identities that they had developed on the island. So that in the mid-20th century, for example, Puerto Ricans considered white on the island were denied this social status when they emigrated to the US. Those deemed Black in the US, even though they may not have identified as Black at all in Puerto Rico, were subjected in the US to segregation and all kinds of other racial limitations and vilifications. And so racial experiences could then differ profoundly depending on historical and sociological contexts. And this is something that Jordanna obviously talked about really powerfully in her own narrative about her travels between West Africa and the United States. But on another level, listening really closely to the stories that migrating Puerto Ricans told also taught me that the larger racial regimes, if we want to call it that, which Puerto Ricans inhabited in the US and on the island, these were very, very powerful. But they were also not the only determinants of Puerto Ricans' racial identities. I found when I listened closely to Puerto Rican stories that racial meanings could vary from family to family, from person to person, and even change sometimes in the process of a single person's storytelling, so that Blackness could be understood by the same person as both biologically based and as completely unrelated to phenotype. Blackness could be the product instead, in Puerto Rican stories about race, of a group's positioning in a colonial political economy, or of their cultural expressions, or of an individual's person's chosen identification with Blackness. Not just a political identification, but an identification as a Black person, even if they had not been within their broader community considered white. And this is a possibility for Puerto Ricans in ways that perhaps may not be possibilities in other circumstances. So for many Puerto Ricans, I found, depending on historical circumstances, multiple interpretations of race could exist simultaneously. Ultimately, then, I think attention to storytelling and the nuances of meaning that people create in the stories they tell about their own lives, about their communities, and about their context, is that we can see that certainly a broad interpretive framework for analyzing race and its effects is absolutely essential, but only paying attention to broad patterns might be insufficient, no matter how carefully those frameworks are contextualized, because the work that race does is very messy business, and it's not necessarily reducible to clearly delineated and sort of mono-layered policies or patterns.
Thank you, Eileen. And this really brings me to my question to Marcelo. I'm thinking about this connection between the broad and the particular. And Marcelo, I know your work looks at coloniality and racialization in state bureaucracies in Bolivia specifically, and Latin America more broadly. I wonder if you could speak a little bit about the ways this research approach informs your specific academic practices on anti-racism and decoloniality.
Thank you. Yeah, so, one of the key things that I took, so in many ways, the research, the ethnographic research that I conducted for my doctoral dissertation ultimately ended inspiring and informing a lot of the kind of academic practices that I adopt. So, what I ended up doing, and I'm working on a book project on this, I conducted an ethnography of the Bolivian Foreign Ministry after 2006, in a period in which the government was actively incorporating, an unprecedented level of indigenous origin Bolivians into government, and the foreign ministry in particular, as well as what was broadly understood as indigenous worldviews. And so while I was there, I was kind of following closely how people related, how they understood this project, how they negotiated racial meanings, how they renegotiated indigeneity and what diplomacy is and all that. And one of the major findings of this project was that, the way that we imagine the ideal diplomat, but also more broadly, the ideal bureaucrat, the ideal statesman, and I emphasize man here because it's also very gendered in the way that it's imagined, that the ways that we imagine these state actors, representatives, are historically racialized, right? They were constructed in the history of racist and racial exclusion, and they were also constructed through racial thinking that changed over decades, right? About who deserves to be, who can govern, who is to obey, or things like that. But at the same time, that then once that is constituted, that idea of who is a worthy bureaucrat or a worthy diplomat, once that is constituted, once people adhere to it, it works towards reproducing those inequalities and exclusions within those organizational spaces of the state, right? So that was, kind of looking at that firsthand in that project was helpful to thinking about other spaces that are similar, like academia, like universities, right? Where, for example, we may emphasize the kind of racial presence, we may equate racial presence, kind of, oftentimes considered tokenism or increasing numbers, we may equate that to inclusion without really kind of historicizing and highlighting the racialization of the very logics through which we act in the universities, right? And here I want to echo again what Sarah said about counter narratives, because in fact, I think the way that this informs a lot of what I do is through that, through thinking, okay, through my courses, and not only the research that the writing that I do, but through my courses, how can I advance these counter narratives about the world, right? That challenge this kind of Eurocentrism and this European, probably European way of seeing the world that came to structure how we see the world since, the colonial encounters and imperialism and all that. So that's been key to that, and I'll keep it there so that we have time for more questions.
Thank you so much, everyone. So I'm very excited to hear that we have a lot of audience questions coming in, and so we would definitely want to engage with that. So I'm going to start with the first one. One question came in saying this: I'm going to combine two questions. Many faculty think about decolonizing their curriculum, that it is as straightforward as including voices of Black, Indigenous, and people of color authors, artists, researchers in their teaching materials. But it's more complex. How do you ensure that the curriculum and what we are learning in the classroom is from a decolonist perspective, and how do you broaden students' perspectives on this critical issue when we ourselves are conditioned in Western history in K through 12 education? I think I would direct this first to Sarah, since you are doing the work on K through 12 education work right now. So I'll direct this to Sarah first.
Thank you. I was really itching to answer that question. My answer is going to be like a very typical teacher answer, and it's going to be that you have to do what I'm calling re-education. You have to re-educate yourself, because what I'm finding in my research and my questioning of students, my students themselves are sources. I always start my classes sort of asking them questions that help me understand what they know. We were all, for the most part, not exclusively, but we were all brought up in this Eurocentric, very westernized, very patriarchal, very white-centered way of thinking. And so we then go on and we pass it on either passively or actively. And so what I believe very strongly is that we have to re-educate ourselves. I don't see any way of getting around it. I've seen the damage that teaching from a multicultural perspective without re-educating can do. It's one of the motivating factors for my work, where teachers can actively pass on racist stereotypes out of vacuums of knowledge. And so I really think that as we're thinking about decolonizing curricula and not repeating racist trends, like, you have to learn about colonization. It's all there. And so once it becomes a part of you, your perspective shifts on the materials that you're teaching. And if you're not quite there yet, then you can put texts in conversation with each other and teach from a critical thinking point of view. The conversations tend to be more productive. I'm finding in my research that freshmen arrive with what I'm now seeing as epistemologies, right? Things that we know, but also ways of knowing. And that the students who don't arrive with racist ones are not so much students who have been educated in, say, Black systems or whatever, but students who have been taught to think critically, that questioning, and teachers who inspire questioning and intertextual discussion are already ahead of the curve as they're re-educating themselves.
Thank you, Sarah. That's wonderful. I actually kind of want to link this question with another question. And this question I'm directing directly to Jordanna and Marcelo. Jordanna first. How can these classroom and teaching practices be spread to other departments, instructors, and classes where it might not be on the radar right now? Many students may never have a CRGC class, the Critical Race, Gender, and Culture department class, or instructor. And in my experience, unfortunately, many accept the framing provided by their courses, and those who want to push back have to take on an additional burden. Really great question. Jordanna, I'm gonna direct this to you first, and then Marcelo can chime in.
Thank you. That is a tough one. You know, I think that it's not just the responsibility of the people in this room of allies, right? I mean, one thing that frustrates me is if I'm saying one thing, but then I'm actually competing against counter, you know, narratives of what history is, of what truth is, of what's factual. So it's kind of me operating with one line of, right, constructing a truth against other lines, and that is incredibly counterproductive. And so, yeah, I mean, and so much from that K-12 moment, right? What we tell people about what truth is about legacies of racism and decentering it or erasing it is part of creating patriots, right? It's not about creating enlightened or even educated people. It's about creating certain commitments to the nation state, to regimes of power, of domination. And so it is something that you can take a class and certainly become changed, and many students do, but it needs to be more systemic, and that's a huge challenge. And I'll invite other people. I mean, this is something that's part of the decolonial project, right? When we think about anti-racist scholarship, that is it's not the same thing as decolonial, right? Decolonial is the pedagogy. Anti-racist, I would think about is the result that we're trying to get, but the decolonial is the pedagogy. So, yeah.
Thank you, Jordanna. Marcelo, do you want to chime in?
Sure. You know, I think part of the challenge of the question is that it reveals the various fronts in which we do this kind of fight, right? We hold the fight in a way in the classroom, in the way that we construct our syllabi, the choices that we make, you know, but we also, you know, there's another front to it, which is the institutional setup within which we do all this and the kinds of incentives that it offers, right? And therefore, you know, what we can do in the classroom also has to come with a kind of broader institutional commitment to really privilege and advance some of those positions and histories that have been historically marginalized from academia, right? I mean, we could say the same about other institutional fields and settings. In any case, I did want to say that I think, you know, how you do this is, you know, there's two things, which is, you know, one is about partly what was being said earlier by Sarah, right? Like the way that you kind of teach history, the way that you kind of create the setup or lay out the setup in which you're going to teach whatever it is that you're teaching, right? Then there's the other, which is, you know, I do a class that is specifically about race in Latin America, right? And that's about thinking about the history of the idea of race in Latin America, but connecting it to kind of, you know, the broader history of race and colonization and colonial encounters and all that. But then you also have the opportunity, you know, and even if you're not a scholar that specializes in race or racism, I think you have the opportunity, and if you are committed to kind of an anti-racist praxis, perhaps the responsibility to think through how some of these kind of perhaps race-neutral topics that you teach about are in fact not race-neutral if we really situate them in that kind of history of colonization, in which case you have it lays the responsibility on you to think about educating how you think about those concepts, but also how you teach them to your students, right? So if you teach something on, let's say, you know, the state, well, you know, you might want to think about this relationship between state and race or something like that. So I think those are some of the ways in which we can think about this. I did want to say one real quick thing about the previous question. You know, I think the question about what decolonizing the curriculum is a very important one. And in fact, it goes beyond the way that we include or who we include in our syllabi. And decolonial perspectives are, you know, being a person of color doesn't necessarily make you a decolonial scholar or something like that, right? But I did want to say that, you know, when I think about those questions, I also think about, you know, something that I read from a speech that James Baldwin gave to like the associations of teachers, right? And it is still important to incorporate the voices, I think, of people of color, underrepresented minorities, historically excluded populations, because, you know, and this is what Baldwin said, is like, how can we tell our students of color and minorities, historically excluded, that their voice, that they have something to contribute if they don't see themselves in our syllabi, if they don't see their sense in our classrooms, right? So I think that it is, you know, it's not to dismiss this idea of representation in the syllabus, but it's also, I think, an important element related to this question of decolonizing.
Wonderful, Marcelo. This goes into my next question. I will direct this to Sybil. So this question is, what are the ways as academics and artists, especially with the current moment in which anti-racism is becoming mainstream terminology and practice, are you all resisting the flattening and commodification of your work and protecting its complexity and nuance? Further, for those of you doing work rooted in your very identity, especially Black Women X, how are you grappling with the mainstreaming personally and intellectually? I'll direct this to Sybil first.
Thank you, Lily. I want to say just a brief thing about the previous questions too. Beyond decolonizing education in curriculum and materials, it's also how we debunk hierarchy in the classroom. So it's really about holding ourselves very lightly, right, as the quote unquote leader, and how we bring more democratic practices to the classroom, and that we're not above questioning or challenge either. And so how do we allow for constructive challenging, which then offers space for students to grow and become who they are? So it's not just about materials, it's also about what we model in terms of practice. But so there was just that brief note. But commodification has always been a deeply challenging problem in African descended arts. It just is what it is. So what you do is you want to make sure, and what I try and do for artists and students who are grappling with this idea of how do we resist commodification and mainstreaming of our ideas, that you always stay ahead of the curve. So once they start to have this conversation about anti-racism, you come back and you start to have a conversation very specifically about anti-Blackness, right? Like you are staying ahead of that curve. And once somebody starts saying, well, let's all talk about multiculturalism. No, let's talk about what it means specifically to be African descended, or let's talk about what it means to be Latinx, or let's talk about what it means to be lesbian, or let's talk about what it means to be trans. So you are always making sure the specificity stays in the conversation. One of the things that happens today is we lose specificity, and that's when it becomes institutional. And the other thing is, I'm back to that idea of challenge. When someone says, oh, we're here to talk about multiculturalism, and my students are, AU students are great at this. I'm gonna give them a shout out right here. Man, you invite them to a discussion, a panel, a meeting about multiculturalism, anti-racism, and you are not on your game, and you are asking them to do your work, they're gonna call you out. And they're gonna say, well, I've told you 10 times about the way in which campus police, AUPD, treats African-American students, and you keep asking me to revisit my trauma. So let me talk to you about trauma and narratives, and let me talk to you about discursive violence that you're doing right now. They're gonna have that conversation with you, and that means we're doing something right. We're giving them the tools to defend and challenge, and that's what an education should do. And there have been times when I've pivoted in the classroom. I've stopped on the dime and said, you know what, nope, we're gonna read Adrienne Marie Brown. We're gonna read Charlene Carruthers, because you need information to leave this classroom and go out into the world, even if that is this campus, right, and beyond, and challenge what's being said or set to you as normative. And I think our students do a really good job of that. And that's the measure of how effective we are.
Wonderful, thank you, Sybil. And to your point about specificity as a wonderful way to challenge and resist commodification and institutionalization, I want to talk about the specificity in the next question to Eileen first, and then to Theresa. So Eileen, there's a question as follows. What are your thoughts on constructive roles and actions that a white man can have in the work, both personal and systemic, in terms of anti-racism and decolonization?
Yeah, I mean, as white people and working on anti-racism and white North Americans grappling with issues of decoloniality, I think a stance of humility and commitment to listening and learning from those who are both in your classroom, in any movement that, for those of us who are white, we may be involved in, is absolutely critical. And that does not mean that we can't take positions if those of us who are white. It does mean that we need to engage in constant checking of our privileges, of thinking about how are we potentially reproducing either practices, discourses, assumptions that are white supremacist or that are deeply rooted in colonial ways of seeing the world. I'll give you a really quick example. Many, many years ago, I was teaching a course on the history of the Caribbean. And I got to the section on Puerto Rico, and ironically, I'm a specialist in Puerto Rican history, but I had wanted to emphasize other parts of the Caribbean, particularly Haiti and its history, which is so often marginalized even when within the history of the Caribbean. And so I had spent a lot of time on that, and I got to the history of Puerto Rico, and I did a lecture, you know, from my head about the US invasion, et cetera. And I was like, okay, you know, that was all about US colonialism. I was critiquing colonialism. And a Puerto Rican student, this was before we had email, left me a note under my office door and said, Professor, I'm really frightened to say this because you're my professor, but you started talking about the history of Puerto Rico with the invasion of the United States. And that erases the history of Puerto Rico before the US arrived. Now, I knew this. All of my research began in the early 19th century of Puerto Rico. Like my own research, right, was dedicated to unraveling the multiplicities of colonialism and its effects in Puerto Rico. What did I do in that lecture? What did I do in that class? I reduced Puerto Rican history to, even as I was critiquing US colonialism, I implicitly created and powerfully created this vision of Puerto Rican history that began with the US arrival. Bad. So what did I do? I went back into the class the next day and I said to everyone, Orlando gave me this really important comment. This is what he said. He was right. Here is the lecture I should have given. And I gave a completely different lecture, right? So I had to listen to that critique and then do it better. And I also, that did not destroy my capacity to be an effective historian of Puerto Rico, but I screwed up. And that's gonna happen. That is gonna happen a lot. And we must, those of us with privilege, have to be humble enough to hear it and to redo it and to try again and maybe to put our foot in it again and again. But it doesn't mean that what we do is worthless. And it doesn't mean, like, if we drown ourselves in guilt when we screw up, then we're gonna be paralyzed. And paralysis is useless. So I learned a lot and I never made that mistake again.
Thank you, Eileen. This goes into my question to Theresa. I guess I wonder if you could chime in, piggybacking on this question about specificity and positionality as we continue to do the work of being anti-racist, but also decolonizing institutions like higher education. So in addition to this question about positionality, as the founding person of the CRGC, right, of the Critical Race, Gender, and Culture Studies that was a collaborative and now is a department, how do you see us doing the work here at AU, but also beyond in our respective specific positionalities?
Let me just unmute myself. Oh, that's the $1 million question, right? And I recall having this discussion in grad school. You know, I went to a very elite institution and was in an AFAM studies department, and we would constantly have these discussions about what are we doing? To what end? How do we, as, you know, people who are essentially part of the intelligentsia, the bourgeoisie, what is our relationship to these broader struggles? And I'm not entirely convinced that I've figured out the answer to that. One of the things that I have done is just be honest with myself that I am part of the intelligentsia. I am the, you know, the bourgeoisie is me. So if I own that, what is the space in which I have the status and the power to make meaningful material change? And that space since 2013, since I got to AU, has been American University, and in particular in the College of Arts and Sciences. And when I first arrived, I was absolutely flabbergasted that there was no major in African American and African diaspora studies, not even like, let alone the issue of a department, that there was no major. I found that absolutely shocking. That's something that I would expect in a Canadian university in Ontario. It was shocking to me to come to DC and see that, you know, that institutional space and that recognition in the curriculum was not there. So for the next couple of years, I was trying to figure out, how do we actually create an institutional space and the budget lines to make it so that we have more people on this campus who can, you know, embark on a kind of culture change, curriculum change, you know, not just bringing in faces to fulfill sort of a checkbox, but how can we actually create something that will, now it's become a department, you know, and maybe in the future, if elements of that department become, you know, expanded and whatnot, we can re-envision this model again. But at the time, because there wasn't really much there wasn't a lot of budgetary support for hiring people, you know, and again, I'm kind of getting into the weeds here in terms of the, you know, the administering of these programs, but how do we create a space where we can have full-time people who are engaged in interesting work, who can serve the students, who can teach the courses, who can, you know, who can effect change on this campus, right? We often like to talk about what's happening out there as if it's not related to the reality that students face. And let's face it, that faculty face on this campus, that staff face, staff in all levels of the hierarchy, you know, the white male orientation is palpable. And so I personally wanted to be part of that change and bring in, and not just me for the sake of me, but how do we create it so that even if something happened to me tomorrow, that this would still live on, right? And I think that often that kind of nitty-gritty work of creating programs, creating new courses, creating departments, that is not rewarded in our profession. That kind of daily work of just trying to get people, because like, of course, academics are notoriously like cats and you try and herd them and it's going to take a lot of work, but how to do that kind of work when it's not rewarded monetarily, it's not rewarded in terms of your status in the wider world of academia, trying to negotiate that kind of you know, lack of incentive. It has to come from, you know, a kind of personal commitment to anti-racism and decolonial pedagogy. So that's really, I mean, I think in terms of structures, you know, money, how can we create the structure that will attract the money, that will attract the people, so that students don't have to come in, and if one person is on leave, the whole program goes to naught, right? So, you know, obviously that's a very limited sphere of change, but on the other hand, this is my community, this is my place of work, right? This is the place where I have the power and status to make these concrete changes. And we, you know, we sat together on that D-course general ed committee together, and really sought for a recognition in the kind of education that every AU student is going to get. Fight for that recognition. And it's those little things that take a lot of time and a lot of emotional energy that I think we as faculty, we all have to be willing to do it. And for those who aren't involved, sometimes, you know, I'm not necessarily that interested in, you know, gaining the hearts and minds of others, but really just get out of the way and let us do what we need to do. And I think the students often say that, just get out of my way. And sometimes we have to be willing to do that as well.
Thank you, Theresa. I think this is a perfect place to close. I wish we could engage with all of the questions, all the amazing questions you have out there, but our time is short. But to close, I really do want to thank every single one of our panelists. This is really a labor of love. This is really show of your deep commitment to AU and beyond, because this was really short notice and we were able to rally together to get this together and to support the new initiatives that is moving forward here at AU and beyond. Now, keeping in mind recent calls to maintain and grow the intensity of this historical moment in critical thought and creative action, I look forward to the anti-racist and decolonizing work we are deeply committed to building together. Thank you all.